Nearly 2 weeks after the tragedy inside the Reiner family home became public, most people believed they already understood what had happened. Headlines spread quickly. Social media filled the gaps with assumptions, and the story seemed to settle into a familiar pattern. Yet when investigators and close observers began to look more carefully, it became clear that the first version of events left out critical details. These were not dramatic twists meant for shock value, but quiet facts that completely changed how the timeline was understood. One of the earliest and most overlooked details was the role of a routine appointment that afternoon. On Sunday, December 14, 2025, a massage therapist arrived at the Reiner residence in Brentwood, Los Angeles, for a scheduled session. This was not unusual. The appointment was a regular one, booked weekly, and usually took place in the early afternoon. When the therapist arrived, however, there was no response. The gate remained closed, the door unanswered, and repeated attempts to make contact by phone failed. At first, this silence may not have seemed alarming, but as minutes passed, concern grew. The therapist eventually decided to call Romy Reiner, the couple's daughter, who lived nearby. That phone call, made out of uncertainty rather than panic, became the first step in a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. Romy crossed over to her parents' home with mild concern, not fear. There was no reason to expect anything more than a missed appointment or a simple misunderstanding. When she entered the house, everything changed in an instant. She saw her father lying motionless. There are moments the human mind simply cannot prepare for, and this was one of them. Shock does not always look like screaming or crying. Sometimes it looks like complete shutdown. Romy's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She panicked and ran out of the house. At that moment, she did not know that her mother had also died elsewhere in the home. Her mind was focused on the single image she had just seen, an image that shattered her sense of reality. One fact would later become the subject of intense discussion online. Romy did not call 911. This detail was quickly misunderstood and turned into speculation. But in real-life emergencies, especially those involving sudden trauma, there is no single correct response. Psychological shock can paralyze a person, stripping away the ability to think clearly or act logically. In many documented cases, individuals who experience extreme emotional distress are unable to perform even simple tasks. Running away from danger, freezing, or collapsing are all natural reactions. The idea that there is one proper way to behave in such moments is a myth. What mattered more was what happened next. The emergency call did come, and it came quickly. But it was made by someone else. That person's presence would later become a key part of how investigators understood the scene. This first stage of the tragedy was not about suspicion or blame. It was about timing, sequence, and human reaction. The quiet failure of a door to open. The silence of a phone that went unanswered. A daughter stepping into a moment that would divide her life into before and after. These details, while small on their own, formed the foundation of everything that followed. And they revealed that the public version of events was incomplete from the very beginning. When Romy arrived at her parents' house that afternoon, she was not alone. This is another detail that was often missed or misreported in early discussions. She was accompanied by a close male friend named Alex Silberg, someone who was deeply involved in her daily life at the time. Alex was not a random acquaintance. He lived with Romy, worked closely with her, and shared both professional and personal space. Together, They were preparing a short film project, with Romy in a central role and Alex directing. Their lives were closely connected, though Romy never publicly labeled the nature of their relationship. What matters here is not speculation about romance, but presence. Alex was there when everything unfolded. When Romy entered the house and saw her father, she panicked and fled. It was Alex who remained composed enough to act. He was the one who called 911. This fact became crucial later, not because it was suspicious, but because it clarified the sequence of events. In moments of crisis, it is often the person least emotionally attached who is able to take action. Alex did not discover the body himself. He witnessed Romy's reaction, her shock, her loss of control. From an investigative perspective, this mattered. He could confirm where Romy had been, how she arrived, and how she responded. This helped establish a clear and consistent timeline early on. It also prevented unnecessary suspicion from growing around Romy, simply because she was the first family member on the scene. Law enforcement procedures require officers to ask basic questions in situations like this. Who arrived first? Who found the body? Who made the call? These questions are standard, not accusatory. Because Alex was present, many of those questions had immediate answers. His testimony helped confirm that Romy did not arrive alone, did not behave suspiciously, and did not attempt to hide or control the situation. Instead, her reaction aligned with what professionals recognize as acute trauma. Another misconception that spread was the belief that Romy discovered both of her parents at the same time. This is not accurate. She only saw her father. Information about her mother's death came later, after police had already arrived and begun their work. This meant Romy experienced the tragedy in stages, not all at once. First came the shock of seeing her father. Then came the second blow, learning that her mother had also died. Each revelation arrived before she had time to recover from the previous one. During this period, Alex remained with her. He was not only a witness, but also one of the few stable figures in her immediate environment. While other family members were distant or emotionally withdrawn, Alex stayed physically and emotionally present. This contrast became noticeable in the days that followed. Some members of the family appeared disconnected, struggling to function or engage with the outside world. Romy, despite her grief, attempted to maintain some structure through work and routine. Alex supported that effort. None of this explains the tragedy, but it helps explain how Romy survived the first critical hours without being consumed by confusion and misplaced blame. In many high-profile cases, early misunderstandings can permanently damage lives. Rumors harden into beliefs. Online speculation turns into accusations. The presence of a reliable witness at the scene helped prevent that from happening here. Alex's role was not dramatic, but it was essential. He provided clarity when emotions threatened to overwhelm reason. He helped ensure that the focus remained on understanding what happened rather than inventing narratives to fill the silence. Sometimes, the most important figures in a story are not the loudest or most visible, but the ones who quietly anchor reality when everything else feels unstable. As the investigation continued, another claim began circulating widely: that Romy had immediately pointed to her brother Nick as a suspect. This idea spread rapidly, repeated so often that it began to sound like established fact. However, early investigative records tell a different story. When police and medical personnel arrived, Romy provided factual information only. She described the family's living arrangements, including the fact that Nick resided on the property in a separate area. This was not an accusation. It was a response to a direct question. In any investigation, understanding who lives where and who has access to a property is basic procedure. Providing that information does not imply suspicion. It is simply part of establishing context. There is no record of Romy attempting to direct blame or suggest conclusions. Despite this, public narratives often collapse nuance into drama. A simple statement becomes a charged implication. This is especially true in cases involving family tragedy, where emotions run high and audiences look for clear villains or explanations. Investigators, however, move more slowly. They focus on evidence, timelines, and verified accounts. At no point were conclusions publicly drawn in the early stages. No suspects were named. What existed instead was a careful effort to understand the environment inside the home over time. Reports indicated that law enforcement had been called to the residence on multiple occasions in the past. From the outside, the house appeared perfect, quiet, and private. Inside, according to later accounts, there had been long periods of emotional strain. The family did not advertise their struggles. They lived with them quietly. Fear, tension, and unresolved conflict do not always announce themselves loudly. Often, they exist beneath the surface, unnoticed until something breaks. This context does not explain the tragedy, but it does help explain why simple explanations fail. Real life is rarely clean or linear. It is layered, complicated, and shaped by years of small moments rather than one sudden event. As more information emerged, it became clear that the early focus on who called 911 or who arrived first missed the larger picture. Those details mattered, but only as part of a broader understanding. The real questions lay in the long history of relationships, pressures, and unspoken fears within the household. Investigators continued their work methodically, resisting the noise surrounding the case. Meanwhile, the public remained hungry for answers. This gap between official silence and public curiosity is where speculation thrives. But silence does not mean nothing is happening. It often means that those involved are taking care to avoid mistakes that cannot be undone. In the end, the tragedy inside the Reiner home cannot be reduced to a single moment or person. It was the result of a complex web of human emotions, private struggles, and circumstances that unfolded over time. The overlooked details, when examined carefully, do not point toward easy conclusions. Instead, they challenge assumptions and remind us how dangerous it can be to judge incomplete stories. By the time all 7 key details are placed side by side, one truth becomes clear. Much of what people thought they understood was built on fragments. Understanding requires patience, restraint, and empathy. And sometimes, the most shocking realization is not what happened, but how quickly misunderstanding can take hold when silence is filled with noise. When the tragedy first came to light, confusion spread faster than facts. In moments like these, people search for instant answers, often expecting clear reactions and quick conclusions. But real life rarely works that way, especially when trauma strikes without warning. Romy, the younger sister at the center of public attention, suddenly found herself examined not only by investigators, but also by the court of public opinion. Every word she spoke, every pause she took, and even the details she chose to mention were analyzed and reanalyzed. Many observers wrongly assumed that her calm delivery of basic information meant suspicion or hidden knowledge. In reality, what she offered was not an accusation, but context. She explained who lived in the house and what had occurred the night before. Not because she suspected her brother, but because her mind was searching for solid ground in the middle of emotional collapse. Psychological studies show that during extreme shock, the brain often narrows its focus to simple, concrete facts. This is not strategy or deception, it is survival. Romy had just lost both parents in a sudden and unimaginable way, and her mind was operating in a state of disbelief. At such moments, people often cling to familiar images of loved ones. For Romy, her brother was not a criminal figure in her mind, but the person she had grown up with, shared meals with, and known across years of family history. Period. The idea that someone so familiar could cross such an unthinkable boundary was beyond what her stunned thoughts could accept. This gap between public expectation and human psychology created misunderstanding. Media questions quickly followed, and speculation filled the silence that trauma naturally creates. Yet later, major news outlets confirmed that Romy never asked police to investigate her brother. She never presented him as a suspect. She shared only basic living details, which police would have gathered regardless. Investigators developed their case independently, based on evidence and procedure, not family suggestion. When Nick was later arrested near the Exposition Park area, it came as another shock to Romy, layering grief upon grief. At that point, she was forced to face two losses at once: the permanent absence of her parents and the emotional collapse of the sibling bond she once trusted. These losses did not replace each other. They existed side by side, making daily life feel heavy and unfamiliar. Each memory from the past now carried a new meaning, forcing her to look backward through a lens shaped by pain. This is an experience many trauma specialists describe as double grief, where one loss reshapes the understanding of another. From the outside, people may expect clear reactions or decisive emotional responses, but inside, the mind moves slowly, often resisting reality until it has no choice but to accept it. That slow acceptance was mistaken by many as something suspicious, when in truth it was deeply human. Long before the final event, the Reiner household existed under a quiet but constant strain. From the outside, the Brentwood mansion looked calm, private, and untouched by trouble. High walls, closed gates, and expensive surroundings created the image of safety and control. But inside those walls, daily life required constant adjustment. Nick's presence brought unpredictability that shaped how the family lived. Simple routines were influenced by concern, awareness, and caution. This did not begin suddenly. Records show that as early as 2013, police were called to the home for welfare checks. These calls did not always result in action, but they left behind a pattern. Late-night concerns, noise complaints, and moments when the family felt overwhelmed enough to ask for help marked the passing years. Each visit ended quietly, but the frequency told its own story. In 2017, the situation reached a turning point when an official domestic violence investigation was recorded. While details were not publicly released, the existence of such a report mattered. It signaled that the situation had moved beyond emotional instability and into territory that concerned authorities. After that point, police involvement became familiar. Officers recognized the address. They knew the gate and the route. In wealthy neighborhoods like Brentwood, repeated visits to the same home stand out, even when nothing dramatic occurs during each call. By 2019, additional welfare and mental health incidents reinforced the pattern. Despite this, the household continued to function on hope. Rob and Michelle remained deeply supportive of their son. They arranged treatment, supported rehabilitation efforts, and stood by him through repeated setbacks. Over the years, Nick experienced multiple stays in treatment facilities and received serious mental health diagnoses. The family was familiar with loss of control episodes, including damage to property and brief periods without stable housing. Yet, violence toward others was not something they had experienced directly. This distinction shaped their thinking. They believed, as many families do, that love, patience, and structure might eventually lead to improvement. Friends often described the household as warm and affectionate, filled with shared meals and close bonds. Public appearances reinforced this image. Only months before the tragedy, the family stood together at a film premiere, smiling for cameras and appearing united. These moments created the impression that things were stable or improving. But behind the scenes, concern was growing. In the final weeks, Rob and Michelle shared fears with close friends. They spoke openly about being afraid of their son, not out of hatred, but out of confusion and exhaustion. They monitored him closely, avoided leaving him alone, and adjusted their lives to manage his presence. The house became a place of vigilance rather than rest. Every sound carried meaning. Every silence raised questions. Still, they hoped. Hope can persist even when evidence suggests otherwise, especially when it is tied to parental love. Looking back, all the earlier incidents appear like warning lights that were seen but never fully believed. At the time, they felt manageable. In hindsight, they form a continuous line leading toward an outcome no one wanted to imagine. The detail that stands out most in retrospect is not hidden in police records or technical reports. It lies in something simple and deeply human: fear, expressed quietly to trusted people. In the months leading up to the tragedy, Rob and Michelle admitted to friends that they were afraid of Nick. This fear shaped their decisions. They avoided leaving him alone. They brought him with them even when it was uncomfortable or socially awkward. On the night of Conan O'Brien's Christmas party, this fear played a direct role. The event itself was elegant and carefully planned, filled with familiar faces dressed for celebration. Nick did not fit that environment. He arrived wearing casual clothing, withdrawn and distant. He was not on the guest list and did not socialize. He wandered alone, observing rather than participating. Guests noticed his presence without fully understanding why it felt unsettling. Rob and Michelle had asked for permission to bring him because they did not feel safe leaving him at home. This detail changes how the night is understood. It was not a normal family outing. It was an act of protection driven by fear. This is the clue many people missed. Not because it was hidden, but because it was quiet. Fear does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up as small choices, altered plans, and careful supervision. After the tragedy, these details gained new meaning. The repeated police calls, the welfare checks, the mental health concerns, and the private warnings now appear connected rather than isolated. None of them alone predicted the outcome. Together, they reveal a long struggle that reached a breaking point. The final event did not emerge from nowhere. It came from years of instability that the family tried desperately to manage. In the aftermath, the public searched for someone to blame, often focusing on reactions instead of realities. But the deeper lesson lies in understanding how complex situations can evolve quietly over time. Mental illness, addiction, and family love can exist together in painful tension. Support does not always lead to healing, and hope does not guarantee safety. The tragedy forced all the warning signs into focus, illuminating what had been present for years but never fully accepted. For those left behind, the weight of this understanding is heavy. Memories become complicated. Love and fear intertwine. The past cannot be changed, only re-examined. In the end, the most overlooked truth was not a single action or document, but the reality that the people closest to Nick were already afraid. That fear shaped their final choices and stands as the quiet signal that something was deeply wrong long before the final day arrived.